Well, it looks like the Wu flu crisis is starting to wane in Great Britain. Of course, this is always much more a crisis of the mind than it was a crisis of the body. The bigger threat has always been from the fearmongers and, of course, those who promote hysteria than the virus itself. Of course, the virus was a threat, just, not the kind of threat that people made it out to be. And now, finally, the new common cold, better known as the Omicron variant, is being accepted and welcomed with open arms in Great Britain. The British government, led by disgraced Prime Minister Boris Johnson, is acknowledging that, you know what, yeah, this isn't so bad, and we're going to get through this just fine, and he has announced that there will be no new restrictions. I've been watching, seeing what Boris would do. Any new restrictions obviously would be hypocritical in the light of the whole Christmas party scandal from last year. And he's been delaying the announcement of new restrictions. He didn't do it for Christmas, and then he didn't do it for New Year's, and now we're after New Year's, and Boris is saying, nope, not going to happen. And his health folks, the British Faucis, as it were, are saying, yeah, not this Omicron thing, not a big deal. We'll get through this just fine. No new restrictions. Now, of course, there's already a lot of restrictions in Great Britain, but the fact that the restrictions have peaked, I think, is a win. The fact that we have a new scariant out in circulation, that we have a surge in cases, as the media loves to tell us about, the fact that the Brits are not piling on more and more punitive measures to punish the population, that to me is a sign that they're losing steam. And if the Brits are losing steam, I think so too will the U.S. tyrants. Now, does that mean that in places like New York City, life is going to go back to normal? No. I mean, in the UK, they're not letting people go back to normal with their lives. Those people do not have that much freedom. But if the tyranny is peaking, then at some point there is the potential that it will start to taper off, and, well, it's already tapering off, that it will start to decline. We've been waiting and waiting for a climax in the Wu flu hysteria for most of the last 2 years. The Wu flu crisis began 2 years ago this month, and at first, I was considered crazy because I was concerned about it. We knew very little about it, and the more that we learned about it, once it started making its way to the West, we found out, okay, it's not as bad as we initially feared. And so my fear tapered off really, within a couple months. Once it made its way to the West and we started to get, some real life data about how people were faring with the illness, I realized, okay, this is not airborne AIDS. But at the same time that I was coming off of my fear high, that I was calming down and realizing, hey, this is okay, we're good. This isn't so bad. We can make it through this. That's when the normies all of a sudden were whipped up into a frenzy by the mainstream media. And that's when, the demagogues in state capitals across the country and in town and in city halls and in Congress all decided, okay, now that we know that this is, not so bad, now it's time for everybody to be afraid. And so much of the Western population has been deathly afraid and compliant for the last 2 years. And we know now that there is no hope for the vast majority of these people. You're not going to reason with them as long as the authorities tell them that there is reason to be afraid, to be very afraid. They're going to be very afraid. So the only way that this is going to begin to wane is if we see the authorities, people in positions of power, the white lab coat crowd. We need them to be the ones to talk these people down off the ledge. And you could argue, I guess, that this started in South Africa. Because it was there that you had the South African doctors who discovered Omicron saying, hey, this is no big deal. Hey, our hospitals aren't full. You guys should not be worried. You should be happy that the Omicron variant is going to displace the Delta variant, and that this is essentially going to become the common cold. And that messaging, which was first resisted, it was certainly resisted by the British media. The British media does not want this crisis to end. They never want it to end. They want it to go on forever, as does the media around the world, because, if it bleeds, it leads. That's classic. That's the incentive structure of being in the news business. You want there to be a lot of death and destruction the world over. Nobody mourned the fall of Nazi Germany more than the editors of newspapers across the Western world, because it gave them so much less to write about. At least they still had the Japanese to fearmonger about until VJ Day rolled around, I believe that August. And so first we had Cyril Ramaphosa. I never really figured out how he likes his name to be pronounced. I've always heard Ramaphosa, but more recently I've heard people saying Ramaphosa. Anyway, President Cyril announced there would be no new additional Wu flu restrictions placed on the people of South Africa, which is fortunate, but there's already so many restrictions. They had a curfew. So his big thing was, okay, we're going to lift the curfew. You break a man's leg, you hand him a crutch. Hey, the government's a hero, right? But still, that was a good sign. It was a positive sign. If you're in South Africa, this nonsense has peaked. And now it looks like the same thing is happening in Britain. Boris Johnson is following in Cyril's lead. And hopefully, Joseph Robinette Biden, who actually I think we've already seen signs of that, because he said, well, it's a state issue, which is hilarious. And I don't want to get into the hypocrisy of that and all that. There's been plenty of people who've talked about that. But Uncle Joe, too, I think, will be unable to accelerate the hysteria in this country any further. I think, this is a prediction I have, in due time, even Tony Fauci is going to admit that the Omicron variant is basically the common cold. Or, I should say, that the symptoms are reminiscent of the common cold and not of something super scary like Ebola. Now, those on the continent, France, Germany, Austria, they have not given up the ghost when it comes to Wu flu hysteria yet. It's unsurprising. As much as I am not a big fan of Great Britain, I could say they always stand head and shoulders above their continental counterparts when it comes to idiocy. And so, even though the Brits have come around, the Continentals are still lagging behind. They are still clinging to this nonsense. Now, thankfully, there are people rioting in the streets in places like Germany and France and probably in Italy, I'm sure. But their regimes have not accepted reality yet. I mean, obviously, none of them have totally accepted reality. But Britain is starting to turn the tide there. South Africa started to turn around last week or so, whenever or maybe it was the week before, when Ramaphosa lifted the curfew and declared, hey, Omicron's no big deal. And so this will have a cascading effect, I think, around the world. Now, maybe in places like China, they're going to hang on to this for the foreseeable future. But in other places, I do not think that they'll be able to maintain the hysteria once other countries start proving that you can live a normal life and that this virus is pretty much statistically gone. I have to be very careful with my words here, obviously. I don't want to go too far, but at the same time, I still need to get some kind of a point across, or else what the hell's the point in listening to me jabber on for 10 minutes? But once this process begins in earnest, now well, actually, let me go back and address something. People might say, well, Florida and Sweden were reasonable pretty much the whole time, and that didn't undo all of this and begin a cascading effect. Well, no, but I think it's different to never go down the road of hysteria. I think that's different from turning back. Because yes, Florida and Sweden, they never got crazy to begin with, so they didn't have to step back down off that ledge. They didn't build up, an intense, I guess, hysteria industrial complex. They didn't build up a big bureaucracy dedicated to oppressing people and locking them up. They never. It would be a much bigger deal for Australia to come back from where they are now, as an example, than to have a place like Florida or Sweden that never went there to begin with. And so at this point, that's what you want to see. You want to see countries making improvements, countries that were engaging in this insanity, like South Africa, like Britain. You want to see them starting to, come back from the brink and setting an example for other insane countries. Maybe not Australia tomorrow, but maybe France. Maybe they can get better. Austria doesn't seem to be a lot of hope for them, but maybe Italy. And so that's really all I want to see at this point. I just want to see some progress for these people. Because you can't hope for a full recovery. It's going to be a long time before that. It's going to be a long time before, jab passports go away. Although not as long, I think, as people might imagine. Because these jab passports are going to require you to be boosted. And when this crisis is pretty much all over, it's going to be very hard to push people to go and get their booster every 3 months. And so very quickly, you're going to have people who are expired, who are out of date, and who can't travel anywhere. And that is just not going to be practical. Maybe I'll have to eat my words one day. Hopefully I won't. But I think the fact that the jabs are so short-lived in their efficacy, I think that is a blessing to those of us who oppose all the mandates. It makes the mandates less practical. Whereas if this shot was a one-and-done thing, I think it would be much, much, much easier to impose them on 100% of the population, because people can say, hey, come on, it's an easy thing, it's just one shot, rather than saying 4 shots a year or 5 or 6 shots a year every year for the rest of your life in order for you to do anything. So, with that said, I'm trying to be somewhat optimistic. I will see you back here tomorrow, assuming that the internet holds out.